Good evening and welcome to this online event organised by Shropshire Humanists. My name is Simon Nightingale and I'm the chair of Shropshire Humanists. Shropshire Humanists welcome all to our events, whether they have religious faith or not, and this reflects our commitment to interfaith dialogue and our wish, if at all possible, to work alongside people with other worldviews, religious or not, on projects with similar aims to ours. It's a real pleasure today to see many local people, some humanists, some not, some old friends, some new faces, and some people from other parts of the UK, and even one person from Evanston, north of Chicago. Welcome to you all. And I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers, Mark and Sue Michaels, whom I know well as colleagues on both Shrewsbury Interfaith Forum and South Shropshire Interfaith Forum, as well as on SACRE. SACRE stands for the Standing Advisory Council on Religious Education. The multi-faith members of SACRE oversees the local religious education syllabus, as well as overseeing the compulsory acts of mainly Christian collective worship that by law, every primary and secondary school pupil has to attend every school day. Not just church schools, but all government-funded schools. Mark and Sue are involved in a number of interfaith activities and they go into schools to talk about Judaism. They're also well-known local public figures. Mark has been the mayor of Montgomery, a beautiful small town, one of Shropshire's many gems. So I'm delighted to introduce my colleagues and good friends, Mark and Sue.
Good evening. Thank you for inviting us to speak to Shropshire Humanists this evening. First, a bit about us. Living in rural Mid Wales was a choice. We moved from London in 1990. We're 74 miles from the nearest synagogue in Birmingham and even further from the next nearest in Liverpool, Manchester, Bristol, Cardiff, and although contrary to our friend's belief, that wasn't the reason for the move. We owned and ran a small hotel for 23 years whilst raising a young family, where we were very open about our Jewishness in the local community, where many had never met a Jew. We are keen that people who don't encounter Jews in their day-to-day lives have a realistic impression of who we are and who we are not. I grew up in a family that belonged to an Orthodox synagogue, were very connected to our Jewish identity and heritage, but who were not very observant. I joined a Reformed synagogue youth club and then the synagogue to which it was attached. Sue's family were Reformed synagogue members. We take for granted that our own religion, political party or nationality is diverse, but we tend to see others under a spotlight of uniformity and a caricatured one at that. If I say Australian to you, what do you see in your mind's eye? If not a white man with corks round his hat and a Crocodile Dundee penchant for big knives and cold beers, then I suspect most at least visualise a Caucasian, outdoorsy, cricket and rugby playing, barbecue enjoying Shane Warne lookalike. Where is the shared diversity? Male and female, native Australian and Vietnamese boat person origin, city dweller and outback farmer. For many, if not most, Jews and Sikhs, Muslims and Hindus who take little interest in other faiths, the Pope is the head of the Christian faith. That might not go down too well in some parts of the Christian world. Robert Burns' famous quote, without a Scottish accent and in modern English, "Oh, would some power the gift give us to see ourselves as others see us," is of course immensely valuable and perceptive. But the converse is equally true. We need to see others as they see themselves. That was the conclusion of the Macpherson report into the police handling of the murder of Stephen Lawrence. Racism should be judged by the impact on the recipient. If we closely support a political party, whichever one it is, we know that ours is a broad church. The other lot, of course, are all the same. I have little or no interest in football, so to some of you, my perspective that all football clubs and their fans are much the same, whether in blue or red, claret or canary yellow, is heresy. In order to look at diversity within Judaism and amongst Jews, which are not quite the same thing, we need to understand what each is. Judaism, although practiced in many ways, is relatively straightforward. It is a religion originating in the Middle East around 4,000 years ago, practiced in different ways and with different levels of religious observance. Jews, now that's more complicated. We all have many strands to our identities. These are just some of mine, in no particular order. They of course overlap, sometimes reinforcing and sometimes contradicting one another. In biblical times, Jewish identity was patrilineal, Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, etc. However, over time this changed to become matrilineal. The rabbis say that in times of war and persecution, where rape was a weapon of war, plus ça change, this protected children born through no fault of their own to a Jewish mother and non-Jewish father. Ever practical, you always know who your mother is. Of the father, you may not always be so sure. This ensured that the children were always accepted and cared for in the community. Today, Orthodox communities are strictly matrilineal, but Reform and Progressives are now equilineal, recognizing as Jewish the children of either a Jewish mother or a Jewish father. To be recognized as a Jew requires no element of belief, knowledge, or religious observance, unless converting. It is perfectly possible for a secular, atheist Jewish couple to marry in an Orthodox synagogue, subject to the individual rabbi's agreement. How do you prove you are Jewish? The traditional proof is the ketubah, the Jewish certificate of marriage contract from an Orthodox synagogue. This belongs to my great-grandparents and is typical. What if there is no Orthodox ketubah from your mother? No problem. Do you have one from your mother's mother? This would need corresponding birth certificates. Our daughters? We were married in a Reform synagogue, as were Sue's parents, but Sue's mother's mother in an Orthodox one. This would entitle them to marry in an Orthodox synagogue. Can in theory be as many generations as you like. Recognized by who? An acceptable body. To be accepted in an Orthodox community, the conversion must be Orthodox. In a progressive community, the conversion can be Orthodox or progressive. As we progress this evening, it is worth considering the title of a book by the late Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, Lord Sacks, One People. Please note the question mark. In it, he remembers noticing as a young man at Cambridge in 1967, when the 6 Days War broke out, there were suddenly far, far more people identifying as Jewish. They never went to synagogue or attended Jewish society events, but push comes to shove, they were Jews. Some of you may recall historian Simon Sharma's 2013 BBC TV series, The Story of the Jews. For his conclusion, you'll need to wait to the end of this talk. How did Jews come to be so spread out and so diverse? The reason lies at least in part in a series of expulsions and persecutions. The Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BCE sacked Jerusalem, destroyed King Solomon's temple and carted off the population. They were later released by the Persians, and those who wanted to permitted to return and rebuild. The Romans in 70 CE quashed a rebellion, destroyed the Second Temple and expelled much of the population. The expulsion from Spain and Portugal, beginning in 1492, preceded incidentally by expulsion from Britain in 1290. Pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe from the mid-19th century resulted in a large Jewish emigration to America and a swelling of Jewish populations in Western Europe, culminating in the Holocaust. Diversity amongst Jews and in Judaism is nothing new. Josephus, the first-century historian, noted three groups of Jews: Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. Clearly, being Jewish is not a question of nationality. There are Jews in very many countries in the world today, although it doesn't take much imagination to see how that would have been so different in 1850, 1900, 1930, and 1945. There are three traditional divisions within Judaism, where living in different areas amongst different cultures and languages, they developed over many centuries distinct strands: Sephardi, Ashkenazi, and Mizrahi, each having their own traditions within worship and interpretation of Jewish law, tradition, and custom, not to mention diversity of food, music, art, and literature, as they mingled and assimilated in very different cultures. A large Jewish community prospered in the Iberian Peninsula from biblical expulsion through to the reign of Ferdinand and Isabella. The integrated communities of Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived successfully side by side for many generations. On expulsion, many Jews went into hiding to be flushed out by the Inquisition. Some converted, some pretended to convert, and a good many went to the Netherlands, from where a small group petitioned Cromwell's government, and eventually the Sephardic community in Britain was permitted. There were conditions, of course: no proselytizing, no conversion, and no intermarriage. Their language was Ladino, a mixture of Spanish, Portuguese, and Hebrew.
Kosher food. As some of the differences include food, I'd better give you some idea of the complex rules around kosher food, known as kashrut. All meat must be slaughtered in accordance with rules set in biblical times, considered then to be the most humane method, and removing all blood. Animals allowed must have both a cloven hoof and chew the cud, so they're true herbivores and do not kill or scavenge. So cattle, sheep and deer are examples of what is permitted. No dairy may be consumed with or for 3 hours after meat. And fish must have fins and scales, which excludes shellfish, carnivores and scavengers too. Sephardi cuisine emphasises salads, stuffed vegetables and vine leaves, olive oils, lentils, fresh and dried fruits, herbs and nuts and chickpeas. Meat dishes often make use of lamb or ground beef. Fresh lemon juice is added to many soups and sauces. And many meat and rice dishes incorporate dried fruits, such as apricots, prunes and raisins, and pine nuts are used as a garnish.
Typically, Ashkenazi Jews are seen as hailing from Northern and Eastern Europe. In the Middle Ages, communities were pushed out from Britain and then the Rhineland by Crusaders, making their way east and settling gradually in areas from the Baltic states south through Poland, Russia and Galicia, ending up with a permitted pale of settlement, including parts of modern-day Belarus and Ukraine. As anti-Semitic pogroms increased from the mid-19th century, Jews moved to Western Europe, especially Germany, France and Britain, and of course America. Fiddler on the Roof rings true, almost as family history for many Ashkenazi Jews. They were often penniless and not always welcomed by small, long-established, prosperous Sephardi communities, as illustrated in Israel Zangwill's book King of the Schnorrers. They spoke Yiddish, different dialects including elements of German, Hebrew, Polish and Russian, as well as Russian, Polish and other languages, whereas their host established Jewish communities spoke either the language of the country or Ladino. There were approaching 150 synagogues in the Jewish East End of London in its heyday around 1900. Most of Sue's and my ancestors arrived between 1860 and 1890. All our grandparents were born in Britain.
After having been expelled from Western Europe in the Middle Ages, Jews were forced to live in poverty and thus were limited in terms of ingredients. Dishes were made with fewer components. They were not heavily spiced, and ingredients that were more flavourful had to be used sparingly due to cost. This is often why some dishes in Ashkenazi cuisine have a reputation for being bland relative to dishes in Sephardic or Mizrahi cuisine.
Mizrahi or Oriental Jews are the descendants of the local Jewish communities that had existed in Western Asia and North Africa from biblical times into the modern era. Large communities flourished in places such as Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Iraq, Iran, and Yemen. Regrettably, these communities have almost entirely vanished, with their populations either being expelled or leaving voluntarily through a mix of fear and Zionism since the formation of Israel. Israel is occasionally perceived by detractors in the West as a colonial enterprise, with some saying they should go home, seeing Israelis as coming from Eastern Europe and America post-Holocaust. This, of course, is only half the story. I'm not sure of the welcome that would await perhaps 2 million third-generation Israelis of Arab and Iranian descent if they attempted to return.
Coming from the Mediterranean and sunny climes, Mizrahi cuisine is often light, with an emphasis on salads, stuffed vegetables and vine leaves, olive oil, lentils, fresh and dried fruits, herbs and nuts, and chickpeas, very similar to Sephardi. Meat dishes are often made use of lamb or ground beef. Fresh lemon juice is also added to make soups and sauces. Many meat and rice dishes incorporate dried fruits such as apricot, prunes and raisins. Pine nuts are also used as a garnish, and pomegranate juice is a staple of Persian Jewish cuisine. Ashkenazi Shabbat food includes gefilte fish, stuffed fish, made from a mixture of ground fish, chicken soup, cholent, which is a hearty stew, usually made with meat, and kugel, potato or noodle pudding or casserole. On Shabbat, Sabbath, the Jews of North Africa and Tunisia and Morocco serve haim, a fish in spicy tomato sauce. One slow-cooked food was ropa vieja, which actually translates as old clothes, as the story goes, that an old man shredded his clothes to eat. So it's a dish of shredded meat and vegetables that resemble rags. Shabbat foods are often slow-cooked prior to Shabbat and kept warm overnight once cooked, as cooking is forbidden on Shabbat by Jewish law. In Yemenite cooking, Shabbat dishes include jachnun, a pastry dish, and kubane, a Yemeni bread. Ashkenazi Jews who are of European descent have historically avoided rice, beans, corn and other foods like lentils and soya beans at Passover. The tradition goes back to the 13th century when custom dictated a prohibition against wheat, barley, oats, rice, rye and spelt. Sephardi and Mizrahi cooking differs substantially from Ashkenazi cooking on Passover due to rabbinic rulings that allow the consumption of kininiot, a category which is forbidden to Ashkenazi Jews. They're legumes and some grains, which include rice and a variety of beans and pulses. Charoset, a sweet paste used to symbolize the mortar used by the Hebrew slaves before the Exodus. A classic Ashkenazi charoset couldn't be easier. It's straightforward mix of apples, toasted walnuts or ground almonds, and sweet red wine with some sugar and cinnamon tossed in for good measure. But Sephardic charoset is usually made as a paste from raisins, figs and dates.
These are not the classical racial divisions, but my own selection as examples. There are Jews of all races. There are Caucasian Jews, both Ashkenazi and Sephardi, living all over the world, with large populations in America, Europe and Australia. Much of the Russian Jewish population eventually emigrated when finally permitted in the 70s and 80s. There were some very high-profile evacuations in the 60s and 70s where communities were facing persecution and starvation. These communities claimed ancestry from the 10 lost tribes of Israel. They practiced many of the laws from the Torah and considered themselves to be Jews for many, many generations. There was some dispute in Israel, I suspect tinged with not a small amount of underlying racism. However, the chief rabbis eventually agreed and they were deemed to be Jews for the purpose at least of the law of return. There have regrettably been some issues of absorption and integration caused by colour. I'm afraid Jews, like all groups, are not exempt from racist, prejudiced individuals. They should know better. This is an interesting group. Before we visited Kerala, we were recommended to read The Last Jews of Kerala, the 2,000-year history of India's forgotten Jewish community by Edna Fernandez. Here there were two distinct communities, the black Jews, who claimed descent from Jews who fled the destruction of King Solomon's temple in 586 BCE, and the white Jews who were newly arrived after the expulsion from Spain in 1486. Intermarriage was forbidden between the two groups. Much of the population has now emigrated to Israel. The story revolves around a young couple, one from each community, the last marriageable couple who might provide for a continuity for the Jews of Kerala. The Chinese community dates from the Silk Road, but became established in Kaifeng as a designated settlement area under the Tang dynasty. It was supplemented, at least for a while, by Jews fleeing the Holocaust. Some 20,000 found refuge in Shanghai. My mum's family hosted a girl, Helen, from the Kindertransport. Her parents made it from Germany to America via the Trans-Siberian Railway and a stay in Harbin. Now we come to religious observance, but first a story or two. Sue and I were at the wedding of Muslim friends who, being observant, instead of music, there was an after-dinner speaker who told many jokes that we found extremely funny. Others at our table were a little bemused as to why we, a Jewish couple, found stories about Muslim life so funny. We'd heard them all before, as Jewish jokes by Jewish speakers, in particular the story of the observant Muslim man who was shipwrecked on a desert island. When rescued, the ship's captain was met by the sight of 3 newly built mosques. "Why 3?" he asked. The gent pointed at 2 and told him, "Those are the 2 I don't go to." We'd last heard it told as Mr. Cohen, who'd built 3 synagogues. So diversity within religions, or indeed within any identity, is not unique to Jews. There is always the interplay between all the different identities that we juggle with. When we, an English couple, moved to Wales, we very soon discovered that rugby is not a sport. It is a religion, bound up with history, culture and class. I decided that, unlike my new Welsh friends, I would support Wales against anyone, except England. Sue decided to return to her bilingual educational roots at a French school, sit on King Offa's fence and support France. Our home has its moments during the Six Nations. The ultra-Orthodox or Haredi groups take their origins mainly from communities in Eastern Europe and are divided into sects depending upon which particular rabbinic school's founder they follow. They tend to live in closed groups with little contact with modernity. Jewish law for them is absolute and immovable. For an insight into this world, Netflix's series Unorthodox has an authentic, if at times caricatured, feel about it. Dress is formal and traditional, with women especially following a code of modesty with hair covered outside the home. Many cover their hair with a wig, scarf or hat. Trousers are not permitted. Long-sleeved shapeless dresses, at least below the knee, are worn with thick tights and flat shoes. Shabbat observance is total, and rules around kosher food adhered to the letter.
Traditionally, Jewish men have covered their heads for centuries as a sign of reverence and respect for God's presence above. Some Jewish women cover their hair when they're married in order to be modest in appearance. Haredi Jews, often recognised by their distinctive dress, including large black hats which are worn during the week, and fancier, sometimes fur hats are favoured on Shabbat and other special occasions. These are generally worn over a kippah because 2 head coverings are considered more meritorious than 1, and when taking off the big hat indoors, there's no risk of remaining uncovered. Not all Hasidic Jews wear fur hats. Members of Chabad, for example, favour fedoras. During the week especially, other sects wear hoisha hats, black, high-crowned hats with brims. The Platish Abiba hat is similar but has a lower profile. Sometimes the head of yeshiva, a Jewish house of study, will wear a variation of one of these hats with the brim turned up. Some Hasidic children wear a hat called a kashket as an alternative to kippah. This is shaped like a Burkharian kippah, having wide band and no brim, but it's usually entirely black and made of felt. The fez is cylindrical red cap, sometimes with a tassel traditionally worn by Jews from the former Ottoman Empire, especially Morocco. Jews tend to call it by its Arabic name, tabush. A kippah in Hebrew or yarmulke in Yiddish is a kind of minimal cap that covers the crown of the head. It's worn for religious purposes, not for sun protection or keeping off rain. There are several styles of kippot, the plural of kippah, that are common around the world. Often the style of kippah worn signals the religious and even political affiliation of the wearer. Black scientifically is the absence of colour. Wearing black only indicates lack of concern for colour and other dictates of fashion, and thus helps keep priorities straight. In old sociological terms, to be inner-directed rather than other-directed. Anyway, it certainly eliminates the pressure of deciding what to wear each morning. Long garments are a sign of respect. Nowadays, most people wear them only at the fanciest of affairs. Some religious Jews wear them only on special occasions, such as Shabbat and the festivals. Others feel that every moment is a special occasion, because at every moment one has to be constantly prepared for prayer, Torah, study, etc.
Again, the Torah is absolute, but they do not live in closed communities and will be seen out and about, men wearing a kippah, the skull cap. In the UK, most modern Orthodox synagogues belong to the United Synagogues organisation that elects the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom and Commonwealth. He is therefore not the chief rabbi of Reform and Progressive Judaism. However, on any broad area of common interest, they will take his lead, and he then speaks for all. Some will recall the furore when Holocaust survivor Reform Rabbi Hugo Gryn, broadcaster of Moral Maze fame, died. Jonathan Sacks did not attend the funeral, as it was a Reform service. Although the Sacks and Gryns were on personally excellent terms, he visited their home to pay his respects. This came very close to the Reform and Progressive movements appointing their own chief rabbi. The only saving grace was that the Haredi groups were equally critical because he expressed his condolences to what they perceived as a heretic. It is quite possible to be a member of an Orthodox synagogue but not be very observant. Many will consider rules around synagogue attendance, dress code, Shabbat observance and kashrut in a more flexible way, often making compromises to fit modern life with a feel for heritage too.
Note that men and women sit separately, either women in an upstairs gallery or separated by a screen downstairs, apparently to stop women from distracting the men. Women take no part in the service but follow and join in from a prayer book only.
Masorti Judaism is the newest grouping and is closest to modern Orthodoxy, more or less the same as what's called conservative in the United States, but has parity of roles and esteem for women in the synagogue. We were married in a London Reform synagogue by the first British female rabbi. My mother's modern Orthodox, not very observant Birmingham family could be heard muttering, "All this distance? Reform? Female rabbi, and she's pregnant." Actually, she was 8.5 months pregnant. Men and women sit together and have complete parity. Torah is deemed to be written by man, notionally Moses, divinely inspired, but not the literal word of God. It is there for mankind to be guided by and interpret for the modern world. Some Reformed Jews will choose to be Shabbat observant and keep to strictly kosher food, but most will make compromises.
This is the synagogue where we were married, but that's not us there, and our typically ornate Reform synagogue. Note the marriage canopy because I'll refer to it again later.
We are members of Birmingham Progressive Synagogue. Liberal or progressive Judaism in its early days was seen as very radical. Services were entirely in English, head coverings and tallit, the prayer shawl, optional and little in evidence. They have gradually moved now to a position with almost as much Hebrew as Reform, nearly every male with head covering and tallit, and more women wearing them too. Sue threatens to move to Birmingham Orthodox, where my parents were married, if it ever became compulsory for women. For us, the nature of progressive Judaism is ability and indeed requirement to make informed choices. That doesn't make those choices all rational. After all, a heritage that is a mixture of religion, ethnicity, nationality and race, all scrambled together, occasionally forces strange choices.
This is the very new progressive synagogue in Birmingham where we are members. The top pictures from our daughter's wedding. Remember the canopy at West London? Here she chose a rose arch to symbolise that, and her husband is about to break the glass with his foot in the traditional manner. At Jewish weddings, 7 traditional blessings are read. They chose 7 family members and friends to deliver readings that were important to them. Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. Anna, who lives in Somerset, will drive to London and back for a New Year family lunch, complete with traditional apple and honey, but not to go to synagogue. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the 25-hour complete fast. Our other daughter will work throughout it, abstain from eating, but will have a hot chocolate for energy. When we were in Hong Kong, we were lucky enough to be invited to Shabbat Orthodox service. Mark was welcomed like a long-lost member and included in the service. I was ignored completely because in my 6-month traveller's rucksack, I didn't have quite modest enough clothing and turned up in trousers. I grew up in a home that had ham and bacon but no pork. This was due to my grandmother's compromises during the war to feed her daughter. And if you're interested in more of those quirks and compromises that we and others make, we're happy to answer any questions later.
You cannot decide to be a Jew and just say, I believe this, I do this, I am a Jew. Likewise, you cannot become not a Jew by doing the converse. The holy secular Jew is a concept very mainstream in America and Israel, but less so elsewhere, encapsulated in Israel by the very different identities of Tel Aviv compared to Jerusalem. Tel Aviv, hedonistic, secular, full of nightclubs, going to the beach on Jewish holy days. Jerusalem, much more rooted in its Jewish heritage and with an ancient Jewish quarter. For secular Jews, the 2021 UK census was controversial. It offered Judaism as a religion, but not as a race. What box did a secular atheist Jew tick? A progressive Jew lying in a hospital bed would not be pleased to be visited by a Haredi rabbi who tried to strap tefillin, the little black boxes containing prayers, to his arm and forehead. Likewise, a Haredi man in hospital would have a pink fit if a female progressive rabbi called on him. At the Western Wall in Jerusalem, there are regular disputes between those of an Orthodox traditional view that women should dress modestly and not lead services or read from the Torah scroll, worshipping separately from men, and those who demand total parity and that men and women should be able to mingle at the wall, pray together, wear head coverings and prayer shawls or not, irrespective of gender, and carry, read from and otherwise interact with the scrolls with equality. The women leading this are known as the women of the wall.
Common features of Shabbat is basically a special family time. For the Orthodox, strict observance from sunset Friday night to 1 hour after sunset on Saturday night. No work, no driving, walk to synagogue, Friday evening again and again on Saturdays. Strict Shabbat observance requires no creating a spark, so the most observant will not use electricity, thus no Zoom Shabbat or festival services during lockdown. Hats or kippot worn not like Mark and the one above, but needs must. Reform, liberal, they will encourage family to be together on Friday nights. There'll be a short Friday night blessing. Many may or may not attend synagogue, and they'll drive where necessary, and we're able to use Zoom. At all Jewish funerals have some common features. The burial takes place in a plain wooden coffin with no adornments. In Israel, a shroud only is often used. A yahrzeit memorial candle will be lit on the anniversary of the death. Cut flowers are not used, and stones are left to show memory and respect. You don't cut a living flower to memorialise, but a stone is everlasting, and in biblical times added to the cairn protecting the remains. Ashkenazi gravestones are normally vertical, but meant to be all similar with restrictions on height. Sephardi stones are horizontal, the principle being that we leave the world equal and without possessions as we entered it. In Orthodox tradition, the body should not be left alone between death and funeral, and should be buried in the ground intact. Organ donation is acceptable as it saves lives. The funeral will stick to the traditional format with the rabbi delivering any eulogy. Men and women stand separately at the burial service, and close family members, men only, fill in the grave. Immediate family tear some of their clothing, mirrors are covered, and traditionally symbolic food is eaten. The 7-day mourning period known as Shiva is observed by immediate family. Lesser mourning continues for up to 30 days. For Reform liberal Judaism would allow cremation and use a similar basic format, but are able to add music and readings, often with family members giving the eulogies. Dark clothing is usually worn, and the number of days the family sits Shiva will vary. Men and women are together for the burial service.
Jews have been active in British politics since the 19th century, with many MPs. The above just a few recent prominent names and examples. Traditionally, Jews were on the left of British politics, with a few notable exceptions in the Thatcher years. Well, she was MP for Finchley after all. Hence the dismay at not just the anti-Semitism in a part of the modern Labour Party, but worse, the leadership's failure to act quickly and decisively. For most Jews, Zionism has a simple definition. It is the desire for a Jewish state in its ancient homeland and its safe continuation. No more and no less. A small and diminishing number of Haredi Jews see the formation of a Jewish state before the coming of a Messiah as heretical. Likewise, a very small contingent of Jews on the liberal left see the formation of Israel as a colonial enterprise displacing an indigenous people. The Israeli-Palestinian question has been described as an unusual conflict where both sides are in the right. Most Jews have some personal connection with Israel, friends or family members who live there. For many, it's just a feeling that in a post-Holocaust world where anti-Semitism is not dead and buried, there will always be one safe place: Israel. For me, and this is very much the personal view of a Jew living for 30 years outside the bubble of Jewish community, Jews in the diaspora are not and have not been for too long willing enough to criticize Israeli government policies publicly. Although I fully understand the distaste at washing our dirty linen in public, combined with a feeling of disloyalty and a query as to the questioner's motives. Genuine concern for Palestinian rights or a latent anti-Semitism? Israel has a very free press, which is hugely critical of the state from within. We do not see enough of that journalism attributed to Israelis here. The relationship between Israel and American Jewry in particular, is of interest. In the USA, a large part of the Jewish community is on the Democratic left and felt themselves torn first when Obama, who on everything else was their pin-up, was in head-on collision with Netanyahu's government, and then under Trump, the pull was the other way. They loathed his persona and politics, but found his relationship with Israel much more comfortable. Netanyahu's government had a tendency to be dismissive of the diaspora. Hopefully, the new widely based coalition under Bennett will be easier to engage with. Israel has on the whole been a uniting force for Jews divided in other ways. That seems to be changing in liberal Western democracies, where it is starting to be a dividing issue. A short quote from this book, post the Six-Day War. All of a sudden, after 2,000 years of exile and persecution, the Jews have become a success story, but not with just one success. Two separate stories whose very successes contradict and rebuff each other. American Jews were finally proving that in the land of the free there was no need for a Jewish homeland, and Israeli Jews were proving that only in their homeland could Jews be truly free. As Jews, we reflect on a history awash with persecution. However, when it comes close to home, it becomes more than just an underlying ripple in our otherwise mostly calm Jewish British existence. If your grandparents died in Auschwitz, or your parent or grandparent escaped on the Kindertransport, your lives are forever coloured by it. You are different to those who did not have that experience. If you've been personally subjected to anti-Semitic insult or violence, you think differently to those who have been more fortunate. Going back to my memory of that Muslim wedding comedian, he could not have told those self-same stories at a Jewish function as a Muslim, nor a Jewish speaker have been engaged at the Muslim one. They would respectively have been considered anti-Semitic or Islamophobic. So too the non-Jewish journalist who persistently criticizes Israel without reference to similar or much worse behavior by governments in many, many parts of the world. He runs the risk of being considered anti-Semitic by the Jewish community. We need to hear the authentic voices of legitimate, authentic, not hyperbolic criticism from within. The differences in nationality, religious origin, ethnicity, and more also provide differences in food preferences. As Sue has said, a Sephardi or Mizrahi Jew would look with horror at a pickled herring. A French Jew would look askance at well-done roast beef, however kosher. What would an Ashkenazi Jew from Latvia make of an aubergine or a pomegranate? What is your choice in Jewish music? Klezmer, Bob Dylan, Mahler, or Bernstein? Do you prefer Marc Chagall or Lucian Freud? Remember at the beginning, I said I'd tell you Simon Schama's conclusion. Jews, like many religions and groups, do not all share common ethnicity or nationality, culture or language, politics or religious observance or belief, race or ethics. There are white Jews and black Jews, gay Jews and straight Jews, religious Jews and secular Jews, able Jews and those with disabilities, left-wing Jews and right-wing Jews, Asiatic, African and Caucasian Jews, wealthy Jews and poor Jews, Israeli Jews and diaspora Jews, Zionist Jews and those who are not. Jews with Holocaust survivor heritage and those without. We do not all share similar food, heritage, tradition, music, art, religious observance, or view of our place in the world. So what do we share? Schama's conclusion? We share a common story. We don't need to believe the story, but we still share it. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks's One People? Remember the question mark. That's it. Question time.
Mark and Sue, that was a really wonderful talk. You managed to cover a huge amount of content and discussed a number of important themes clearly and thoughtfully and in such an engaging style. Many thanks on behalf of all of us. But I'm just going to start off by asking Mark and Sue, in a way you've described the range of diversity, but presumably things are changing. The Orthodox keep themselves very much to themselves. They tend to have large families, and I guess their communities are probably staying much the same size. But the other range of Jewish doctrine, are they moving towards the Orthodox? Are they moving towards the Reform? What's your impression? Have you got that?
I think all of the main groupings will tell you that they're all expanding. But my sense is that there is a movement, in numerical movement, to the two edges of the spectrum. That may just be my sense. It may not be based on fact, but my sense is that the reform and progressive end has expanded, and that the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox end, has expanded. But my knowledge in terms of numbers of communities is slim. That's my feeling.
Yes, it's actually analogous to what's happening in Christianity in the UK. The Church of England, which I guess is sort of middle of the road, has plummeted. Only 12% of the population are Church of England and 1% of young people are Church of England. And even among Christians, people who say they are Christian, less than half believe that Jesus was a real person, died, came back to life, and was the Son of God. So half the people who are Christian are probably what you might call cultural Christians and non-theist or atheist indeed. And yet the fastest growing group of Christians in this country are the Pentecostal, the evangelical, and the charismatic. They're still quite small numbers, but they are growing quite rapidly. And if you go to the Barnabas Church in Shrewsbury or the Cromere Baptist Church, they're absolutely packed. Whereas the Church of England services usually have no more than 4 in the congregation on a Sunday, all over the age of 65. So I wonder whether it's similar to that.
I think that there's a parallel, but it's not quite the same.
Yeah.
It's not quite the same. I think, in part, the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox, tend to have very large families, and which is a part of the growth in their close communities. They don't encourage people to leave. It's not, and so their communities grow in that way. The welcoming of patrilineal dissent and the welcoming of conversion in the reform and progressive movements obviously also has an ease of acceptance there, whereas the middle perhaps finds it more difficult. But I don't know. That's an informed guess, not knowledge.
Thank you very much. Somebody's asked an interesting question. They've said, can you explain the various views about Jesus among Jews and their attitudes to Jesus?
Right. I'll give you a flippant answer, and then I'll give you a considered answer. My flippant answer is to ask of Christians, what is the place of the Prophet Muhammad in Christianity? And the reason that I say that with tongue-in-cheek is that the answer is the same as the place of Jesus in Judaism, is that the narrative, the narrative of the story finishes before Jesus appears, or in the case of Christianity, the narrative, the Bible narrative finishes before Muhammad appears. Then to give the more considered answer, which is that from a progressive Jewish point of view, I think most progressive Jews would recognize that Jesus is considered to be Jewish. His manner of teaching, the teachings that are attributed to Jesus, are very much in the 2,000-year-old rabbinic style of storytelling, and that much of his message was not dissimilar to progressive Judaism. However, where the divergence comes between Christians' view of Jesus and Jews' view of Jesus is any consideration of divinity, because for Jews, as for Muslims, perhaps the key core and probably, if you narrow it down, the belief is in a single indivisible God who it cannot be divided in any way. Now many Christians will tell me that that's the same as Christianity, and that the Trinity is only a concept of explanation. However, over very, very many centuries, that has been a cause of division.
That's very interesting. Holly has asked an interesting question. You've described considerable differences in lifestyle and doctrine and behavior among the different sorts of Jews, and some very major, for example, the way women are treated. Has this created a friction within the Jewish community? I mean, is it, how do you cope with those differences?
I think certainly at the extreme, at the poles of those views, certainly I think that they rarely engage with one another. There's not much engagement between progressive Judaism and ultra-Orthodox Judaism. So they are an entirely different lifestyle. The ultra-Orthodox would see progressive Judaism with its role for women as, in Christian terms, heretical. The non-belief in the Torah being the dictated word of God would be seen as heretical. As soon as you come away from an attempt to live every word of Torah, you then come to your own choices. And for me, provided you reason your choices, this is for me, one man's choice is no more nor less valid than another's.
Yeah, that's very
Does
interesting.
that go somewhere near answering the question?
Yes, that's very helpful. Some people have asked about the cooking business and kosher food. Now, obviously, there are some people who practice it, as you say, to the absolute letter and have separate kitchens for meat and things. And if something's contaminated, they bury it in the garden for a certain length of time and so on. Now, do they do this because they think there's a sort of logical reason for it, or because of tradition, or just because they've been told to? I mean, what sort of, how do they rationalize it?
It's both. It's not either or, it's both. Almost every element of Jewish tradition and law has both an ethical and a practical basis. So, for example, the not mixing of milk and meat has an ethical argument. It goes back to a commandment in Leviticus that you shall not see the kid in its mother's milk, which was apparently a Canaanite religious ritual. Now, I can't think of anything ethically much more revolting than finding a baby animal and cooking it in its mother's milk. Ethically revolting. Also practically, in cookery terms, with no refrigeration, milk and meat cooked together was a recipe for curdling and disaster. So practical and ethical. Shellfish, prohibition against eating shellfish. Now, there won't be many people, I suspect, who regularly eat shellfish who haven't had the odd dodgy one, the old bad oyster or bad mussel and regretted it. In a time of no refrigeration, it was food that was likely to make you ill. On an ethical basis, it scavenges. So we don't eat, observant Jews don't eat animals that kill animals or eat dead animals.
If you know what the animals eat and you know what you're eating.
So if anybody's got any questions, you can put your hand up and wave and unmute yourself. Anybody got any more questions? Martin Eldridge.
No, I was struck by a double negative. You said you cannot not become a Jew if in fact you have come in some way from a Jewish family or part Jewish family. I come from a family which is made up of an Englishman who was not Jewish. And my mother came from Vienna and was brought up in a non-observant secular Jewish family. She came here as a refugee fleeing from the Nazis. But she became very interested in Quakerism and actually converted. Well, she didn't convert because I don't think she thought of herself as being particularly religious, but she became very interested and became a Quaker, in a sense, became a Christian. The question is, according to Orthodox rulings, I am in fact Jewish, but do I have any right to say that I'm Jewish? I was brought up as a Quaker, as a Christian. Is it the fact that my heritage, in other words, my maternal grandfather was killed during the Holocaust? Is that somehow an event? And I think our speakers were suggesting that that's such an enormous event that should somehow color my self-perception, my perception of myself. But I'm very unclear about that.
I would say there's no should about it. I'm not saying you should or shouldn't do anything, but if your mother was was Jewish and provably Jewish or attestably Jewish, then by Jewish recognition you are Jewish.
You can change your own personal beliefs. It's like the colour of your eyes. If you're born with one colour eyes, you can put a contact lens in and change it.
Yeah.
But you are what you are.
Yes. So if you met an Orthodox Jewish lady and decided that you'd like to marry in an Orthodox synagogue, and rocked up, and the marriage secretary at the synagogue would say, "Are you both Jewish?" And the lady would get out her parents' Orthodox marriage certificate and her ketubah and say, "Yep, my parents were married in an Orthodox synagogue. That's good enough evidence." And you would say something like, "Well, I'm not absolutely sure about my mother. She came from Vienna. As far as I know, her parents were Orthodox Jews, and but I haven't got much proof of it." The rabbinic authorities would make inquiries, but at the end of the day, it would be up to the rabbi to decide, or the religious court to decide, if there was sufficient evidence that your mother was Jewish. And if they decided that there was, then you could get married in an Orthodox synagogue without, provided that the rabbi, because it's his decision, felt that you were choosing to get married as a Jew, not for convenience.
We've had a question about afterlife, and I'd be really interested to know what you think about the question of afterlife, because for many religions, their view of the afterlife and what happens there actually has a major influence on how they live the life here on earth. So what is it with Jews?
Well, Jonathan Sachs was asked that question, and I'll give you his answer initially, which was that the Torah says very little about afterlife. But it does say that we believe and trust in God. And if we believe and trust in God, live a good life here, and he'll leave the rest to him. That was his answer. It's not entirely the whole truth, because of course we have the concept of the Day of Atonement, and which is about forgiveness of sin and asking God to inscribe you in the book of life for a good life. But atonement, and taking it a little bit away from the afterlife, is about atoning for sins to God. It's not about atoning for sins on earth. So if, Simon, I come downstairs and punch you on the nose, I don't ask God to forgive me for that. I have to get your forgiveness first.
Well, I wouldn't forgive you. So don't do it.
All right, I'll help him back.
Yes, that's an interesting idea.
Yeah. There was another question, I think, in the chat, something about how far back does Judaism go?
Yeah.
Something like that, was it?
Yeah, but, yeah.
How far back to Judaism and the Jewish teaching go? So if one follows the Bible, it sort of goes back about 4,000 years. About 2000 BCE would be when Abraham would be considered to have existed. Having said which, from a progressive Jewish viewpoint, was that Abraham wouldn't have to be an individual. It could be humanity's recognizing that praying to lumps of stone and pieces of wood or the sun or the moon really wasn't very effective, and if there was a God, then it needs to be something more spiritual and more more spiritual. So it doesn't have to be doesn't have to be Abraham. To progressive Jews, doesn't have to be a singular personification. We're in, Sue's just pointing out to me, we're in year 5782, which is notionally back to creation. If you work your way back through the begats in the Bible, and you include Methuselah and some very aged people, you go back to 5,782 years. But certainly progressive Jews would take a modern scientific view. There would be strictly Orthodox Jews who would say 5782, that's what it says. It's just that we don't understand what that means.
Okay, so there are Jewish young earth creationists. Mark and I and Sue are on the Sacre Committee overseeing religious education syllabus in Shropshire. And we are very keen that people should not just learn about the main faiths, but should learn about the diversity within those faiths. We're having a little bit of a struggle persuading the people who run the syllabus to do this.
There are challenges because a lot of the work is within primary schools, and there's an awful lot to fit in. So getting that recognition of diversity and detail of diversity is a challenge. But just the concept of the diversity within all faiths is so important.
The religious education in Shropshire is actually, I think, very good. We have a very good Sacre. There are some issues that need sorting out, but I think the RE teachers are very committed to teaching about diversity and helping people understand different faiths and so on, and it has a good sort of ethical bent as well. I think it's on the whole quite good.
Steve's got his hand up, Simon.
Steve, far away.
Hello, everyone. I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I've got a culturally Jewish myself, so I'd forgotten what a breadth of history and culture I perhaps come from. I just wanted to make try to compare how Islam has developed in this country to how Judaism has. For instance, I noticed that there are many Muslims who are embarrassed, the young Muslims are embarrassed at how irreligious their parents are and have become more religious. I certainly remember back to my grandparents being proud of their children who dropped what they regarded as the ridiculously childish Yiddish accent, dropped the Jewish names and wanted the names to become anglicized, were almost so grateful to have been accepted by this country that they wanted their children to absorb and adopt all of the customs and traditions of this country and drop the Jewishness. I'm just comparing the two. Now, of course, the result of this is there are only, let's say, 600,000 Jews or something in this country, and there are 2.5 million Muslims. The fact that we don't proselytize in Judaism means that over a period of time, I guess, our numbers and our Jewishness is going to become less. And I apologize if I'm rambling somewhat, but I'm speaking somewhat from my own experience. Perhaps I don't have the breadth of view that Mark and Sue have.
There is one difference that we can't get away from, and that is, of course, the difference between Muslim immigration and Jewish immigration, and that is the difference of colour, and that does create different steps in assimilation and mixing and a perception of difference. But the main sweep of Jewish immigration into this country was from 1850 to 1910. So finished over 100 years ago, 4 generations ago. Give the guys a chance. Most are, the majority are second generation. Time to go. Time to settle. Our ancestors in the East End spoke Yiddish, did speak English, and struggled. I think it's easy. Many aspirational fought their way out the East End to make a life, but many didn't. Many got bombed out in the East End. Many were rehoused in the clearances of the East End. I think it's easy to look back at that period of the thriving Jewish East End with rose-tinted spectacles. My grandfather was born in tenements of the East End, one of 6 children in 2 rooms. They had an outside sluice and shared a toilet with the whole of the floor. His mother had 22 pregnancies.
Wow.
He was successful and built a business and moved out from the East End. The other 5 children weren't. So anyway, so does that sort of give an answer to the points you were making, Steve?
I guess so. I mean, my background is both grandparents were born. Both of my grandparents were born in this country. Their older siblings were born in Poland. Both of them were. That's where I originally came from. So around the turn of the century, I guess that would have been. So I don't know. I think there is a difference. If I'm comparing Islam to Judaism, the big advantage with Judaism, from my point of view, is if I find myself at a function, a party of some kind, sitting next to a rabbi, I'm very able to have an argument or a disagreement with him over anything. And he'll enjoy the argument. He'll actually enjoy the disagreement. I cannot imagine a Muslim man having that kind of conversation with an imam. You're not allowed to disagree with it. I guess there's a bit of a difference there. I don't know.
Well, I am able to have that kind of conversation as a Jew with the imam in Craven Arms.
Okay.
He is an exception, though.
Well, he's an exception because he's the only imam I know.
No, I mean, I think we're talking about Sohaib Pebai, who's an excellent chap and a colleague of ours on various committees, and he is prepared to discuss things. But it is true that many imams are quite dogmatic, and they consider questioning as criticism. And
so would an Orthodox rabbi.
I guess that's the same then, yeah. I guess there are imams and imams and rabbis, yeah.
Mm.
And humanists and humanists.
Yeah. There was a question before about David Baddiel's book and what I thought of it from Holly. Yeah, Holly is still there. Good. Yeah, yes, I read it with interest, and I also watched on YouTube his conversation with the Jewish author whose name has just flitted out of my brain, but it was a really good.
Howard Jacobson.
Howard Jacobson. Thank you, Mother. With Howard Jacobson, who were of different generations, and importantly, one from London and one from Manchester. And they very politely disagreed. I thought Baddiel's book excellent. I thought it was a bit rambling, actually. I thought it was all in there, but it sounded like he'd sat down and written it in one go. And as my mum, a journalist, would say, it needed a good editor. But the points were well made, I thought.
That's good to know. Thank you. I'll check out the YouTube video as well. I didn't know that about that, so thank you.
Talking to Howard Jacobson, it's quite nuanced but interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
There are a number of family and friends and Jewish contacts who joined this evening, and I would just remind people of a story of a conversation that was meant to have taken place between David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, and JFK. And JFK was remonstrating with him in the way that American presidents have done since the formation of the state, and saying, listen, I'm president of 200 million people here, and I'm telling you. And Ben-Gurion is reputed to say, yes, but I am Prime Minister of 2 million presidents. So those Jewish friends here who disagree with what I've been saying this evening, that's no surprise.
President, I like that. Yeah.
We're a disputatious lot.
2 Jews, 3 opinions.
Only 3?
That's a good day.
Yeah.
Well, it's now time to draw this event to a close. And may I again say a big, big thank you to Mark and Sue for their wonderful talk about the important diversity and fascinating diversity within Judaism, a subject that can be equally applied to wherever a single identity is used to characterize a group, often leading to an inappropriate and sometimes harmful prejudicial generalization. And thanks also for the excellent questions which Mark and Sue fielded with erudition and good humor. Good night and best wishes to you all from Shropshire Humanists.